Good afternoon and welcome to EntryPoint, where we take a deep dive into the latest entries from Encyclopedia Virginia with the contributors who wrote them and special guests who can help shed light on the past. Excuse me. I'm Patti Miller, the managing editor of Encyclopedia Virginia, and I'm pleased to be hosting today's discussion about the Battle of Great Bridge, which occurred on December 9th, 1775, and was the first major battle of the American Revolution fought in Virginia. For folks who are not familiar with Encyclopedia Virginia, EV is a free, reliable multimedia resource that tells the inclusive story of Virginia for anyone seeking to understand how the past informs the present and the future. We invite you to explore the best and most current scholarship on the history and culture of Virginia at encyclopediavirginia.org. A couple of housekeeping notes before we get started with today's program. Please share your questions for today's panelists using the Q&A tab. This event also has optional closed captioning, which you can turn on and customize at any time with the closed caption tab at the bottom of your screen. So now I'd like to introduce today's guest who will be joining us on screen. First with us today is Dr. Patrick Hannum, who served 29 years as a U.S. Marine and 16 years as a civilian professor at the National Defense University, specializing in Phase 2 Joint Professional Military Education, which is basically, as Pat was just explaining to us, is the strategy of warfare. He is a member of the Sons of the American Revolution based on the service of his fifth great-grandfather, James Hannum, in the Pennsylvania militia. And Pat is also a frequent contributor to the Journal of the American Revolution, which is a great resource for people who want to learn more about the revolution in general. And also with us today is Jon Stull. Jon is a retired Marine and educator, and he is a docent for the Great Bridge Battlefield and Waterways Museum, where he is presently a trustee of the foundation. He joins us today to share this discussion with Pat, whom he had the privilege to serve with at the Joint Forces Staff College for many years. Thank you both for joining us. We're really excited for today's conversation. First of all, before we get started, I have put a link to the entry on the Battle of Great Bridge in the comment section. So I encourage everyone to take a look at that for a really even deeper dive into the Battle of Great Bridge. A full accounting of the battle, also some great primary resources and maps to kind of walk you through the battle as well. So before we get started with our discussion, I want to just set the stage a little bit for what we're going to be talking about and where we are in the revolution right now when we talk about the Battle of Great Bridge. We are in the autumn of 1775, and at this point, the conflict in Virginia between the Patriot and British military forces seems increasingly likely, actual physical warfare. The first shots of the Revolutionary War had been fired in Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts in April of 1775. Relations with the Crown further deteriorated when Virginia's governor, Lord Dunmore, had the gunpowder removed from the public magazine in Williamsburg. By June, Dunmore had been driven out of Williamsburg and to the safety of British warships in the harbor. In July, the Third Virginia Convention created the Virginia Committee of Safety to serve as the executive arm of the Patriot government and authorized the creation of a military force headed by 2 regiments of regular soldiers. The commanders of the 2 regiments, the 1st Virginia Regiment was commanded by Colonel Patrick Henry, who many people are familiar with, but perhaps not as familiar with his role as a military commander in the war. And the 2nd Regiment was commanded by Colonel William Woodford. So this is where we are. It's the fall of 1775. And now Pat is going to take us through the battle, through what happened, and the eventual outcome of the Battle of Great Bridge.
Thank you, Patty. Hopefully, everyone can see my screen there now. So what I'd like to do is start with a brief orientation. When we think of Virginia, this is what we think of today. The geographic boundaries of the state of Virginia, and of course Hampton Roads highlighted in blue down in the corner, and Great Bridge located about 15 miles from the North Carolina line. And so this is what we need to do, is just think about what was different at the time of the American Revolution. And at that time, and of course, this is the Jefferson Fry map, and this was created in 1751, and it's available from the Library of Congress. But it reflects that the northern and western boundaries of what we know as Virginia today were very ill-defined back then. Virginia included all of what's now modern southwestern Pennsylvania, including what's now the city of Pittsburgh. Virginia claimed the area into what is now Ohio, southern Ohio, the entire Ohio River line, all of the state of West Virginia, and basically the state of Kentucky to the west. So Virginia in 1775 was a different geographic area, and this is important to understand. Also, something that came to mind is that the view that the state of Virginia ends at the border with North Carolina didn't really hold in 1775. And this is a contemporary U.S. Census Bureau statistical area for the Virginia Beach, Norfolk area. And you see that it extends south into the Albemarle region of North Carolina. And this is probably how the citizens of 1775, the Revolutionary era, would have viewed things in terms of their transportation, their commerce, and social patterns that existed at that time. And so we kind of view these boundaries, the state lines, as significant barriers to cooperation, and they really didn't see it that way back then. This 1791 map shows portions of Norfolk County and Princess Anne counties. The map, like many of its era, is oriented with north at the bottom, kind of confuses us a bit today. But highlighted in red are the villages of Kemp's Landing and Great Bridge. Now, these would have been considered regional commerce centers and transfer points for cargo from land to water conveyances. Both are located on branches of the Elizabeth River. Now, the city of Norfolk was the gateway to the Chesapeake Bay at the time, resting on the deep water portions of the Elizabeth River. River depths there were capable of supporting ocean-going merchant vessels and military vessels up to 44-gun frigates, so a substantial size of a vessel. So in 1775, Norfolk was the largest city in Virginia. It had a population of about 6,250 people, making it the 8th largest city in North America. Now that you've got a bit of an orientation, let's take a look at the Patriot's line of communications and supply from Williamsburg to Norfolk, which was reflected on this 1781 map, which is traditionally associated with the Yorktown campaign. Now, the blue line represents the line of march or communications from Williamsburg to Norfolk for a land force that had no navy and lacked control of the water. And this is the route that had to be followed by the Patriot Army, commanded by Colonel William Woodford. It extended a distance of nearly 100 miles. Well, the Patriots had no navy, and the British Royal Forces under Lord Dunmore controlled the waterways. Now, to attack Dunmore's force in Norfolk and Princess Anne counties, and that's what Woodford was ordered to do by the Committee of Safety, the Patriots had to first cross the James River, which was being actively patrolled by the British Navy. Most of Woodford's forces crossed in the vicinity of what is today the modern Jamestown, Scotland ferry. They would have then moved through Surrey, Smithfield, Suffolk, and then on to Great Bridge. Their path to Norfolk was blocked by a British stockade, a log fort positioned on the north side of the Great Bridge and Causeway. Understanding the critical importance of Great Bridge, Dunmore ordered the fort constructed in mid-November. This causeway and bridge provided the only land access from Norfolk and Princess Anne counties south into the Albemarle region of North Carolina and west into Suffolk and Nasmond County and beyond. Once Woodford established his army south of Great Bridge, the Patriots were still nearly 20 miles from Norfolk by land. So controlling Great Bridge was the key to holding Norfolk and Princess Anne counties. Today, you know Norfolk and Princess Anne counties as the cities of Virginia Beach, Chesapeake, and Norfolk. Here you see a 19th century lithograph from Lossing's field book of the Revolution that depicts what the Great Bridge looked like. Dunmore's fort would have been on the far side of the bridge near the trees depicted here. Please note the elevated causeway connected to the bridge. This is an important feature that drives much of the battle. Here you see a 21st century artist's rendering of William Billy Flora, a free Black patriot who was serving as a sentry at the south end of the Great Bridge on the morning of December 9th as the British assault force crossed the bridge. Again, note the causeway, not as pronounced on this, but you do see the causeway there. Again, remember, this is an artist's rendering. Here, you see a contemporary recreation of the Great Bridge Causeway constructed on the site of the battlefield and interpretive trail. Now, Jon will talk a little bit more about the interpretive trail, the foundation, and what's physically available to visitors down at the museum. Well, we know how the roadbed was constructed because of archaeological evidence uncovered when the new Great Bridge was built, the new drawbridge. The original construction used a cedar log crib filled with crushed oysters. This provided a cradle to hold the oyster shells that was resistant to rot and a solid, well-drained road surface, which was suitable for the transportation of heavy wagons and carts to cross. The road surface was only wide enough for 6 men to walk abreast. Much of the several hundred yards of the causeway, like the bridge, had swamps on both sides, restricting movement to the surface of the causeway. Therefore, no military formations had room to maneuver off of that causeway. So this Revolutionary era British map in the center is overlaid with red icons representing the British or Loyalist units and blue icons representing the Patriot units. On the morning of December 9th, 1775, 100 British regulars of the 14th Regiment, led by Captain Charles Fordyce, crossed the bridge. About 300 Loyalist militia and a few regulars under the command of Captain Samuel Leslie followed at a safe distance behind in order to exploit any breakthroughs of the Patriot defenses. As the British soldiers advanced towards the Patriot defenses, they came under frontal fire from elements of Captain Richard Kidder Meade's company of the 2nd Virginia Regiment, led by Lieutenant Edward Travis. They also came under fire from the riflemen of the Culpeper Minute Battalion that were positioned on their right flank or the Patriot left. Caught in a Patriot kill zone, the casualties for the British began to mount. Fordyce went down, wrapped a handkerchief around his knee, and then led his men forward. Additional Patriots rushed to the trenches when summoned by their adjutant, Captain Blackburn. This added more firepower to the defenses. This contemporary painting shows Captain Fordyce leading the Grenadiers of the 14th Regiment within 15 paces of the Patriot earthworks before falling for a final time. He called out to his men, "The day is ours, the day is our own," but it was not. A soldier who arrived 2 days later reported he could see the spot on the ground covered by Fordyce's blood, where he bled out and died from his wounds. The attack degenerated into a hasty retreat. Wounded British soldiers, unable to retreat, were captured by the Patriots. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Stevens of the Culpeper Battalion organized a limited pursuit and drove the British across the bridge and into the safety of the fort. The aftermath of the battle is described by both sides. Woodford was encouraged to conduct a pursuit by his engineer and the Adjutant General of Virginia Forces, Colonel Bullitt, another combat veteran. Woodford declined because he was unsure of the potential reinforcements that had reportedly arrived in Norfolk by ship. Days later, he would learn these were not soldiers, but Highland Scots civilians who arrived by ship in Port of Norfolk on their way immigrating to settle in North Carolina. During the hours of darkness on the evening of 9-10 December, Captain Leslie withdrew the surviving British and Loyalist forces to Norfolk. The Patriots occupied Fort Murray the following morning, and reportedly, Captain Goodman from North Carolina and Lieutenant Templeman from the Princess Anne District Minute Battalion were the first men to enter the fort. Upon inspection of the area, Colonel Woodford believed he had delivered a significant defeat, and the victory was complete. He described it as a Bunker Hill in miniature, except we maintained our post and had one man wounded. Lord Dunmore would later report 60 regular casualties. Now, that is 50% of the assault force, and that's a devastating number for 18th century warfare. Also, it's significant to consider that the British regulars in Virginia at this time only numbered 175 officers and men prior to the fight. Total casualties, including the Loyalist militia, were likely closer to 100, with that just one Patriot wounded, a minor wound in the hand at that. One of the British officers killed was Lieutenant Leslie, the nephew of Captain Samuel Leslie, the senior British officer in Virginia, and the officer responsible for conducting this attack. So here you see the same map that you saw previously, the 1781 Yorktown campaign map that shows Hampton Roads area, and with the blue line representing the line of march and communications from Williamsburg to Norfolk for a land force. Now, this is important post-battle as well. Woodford had concerns with the security of this line of communications and supply back to Williamsburg. He was also waiting on reinforcements that he knew were on the way. His force would nearly double in size with the arrival of 3 companies of the 1st Virginia Regiment from Williamsburg and the entire 2nd North Carolina Regiment under the command of Colonel Robert Howe on the 12th of December, just 3 days after the battle. This alone was probably reason to delay an advance. However, perhaps even more critical was the security of his supply line. With no control of the water, the ground supply line was absolutely critical. The bridge at Bachelor's Mill, 8 miles east of, or west of Great Bridge, had either collapsed by or was sabotaged. And the bottom line is his heavy wagons and supplies were delayed actually short of Great Bridge. Without a navy, his ground line of supply was his lifeline. So he took his time and advanced cautiously. He moved a light force to Kemp's Landing, then moved the main body to Norfolk on December 14th. The British had abandoned Norfolk and took refuge aboard ships in Norfolk Harbor. Woodford handed overall command of this Virginia, North Carolina task force to Colonel Robert Howe, but remained in control of his Virginia forces. Now, the reason this happened was North Carolina forces had already been taken into the service of the Continental Army. Therefore, simply based on that, Howe outranked Woodford, and he graciously complied with those instructions. So the next phase of the campaign to completely remove royal authority from Virginia was about to begin in the city of Norfolk. And that city, Norfolk, would not survive that campaign. Great Bridge was a major step in removing royal authority from Virginia. When the process was completed in August 1776, Virginia was not subject to occupation by military forces until the 1781 occupation by Generals Arnold, Phillips, and Cornwallis. We all know how that one ended in October of 1781. So Great Bridge was a major victory for Virginians and a significant factor in removing royal authority from Virginia. It also proved, under the correct circumstances, Virginia forces were capable of defeating British regulars. So with that overview of the battle, I'm going to turn it back over to Patti and Jon and continue on with your discussions.
Thank you, Pat. That's a great overview. Tell us, this was not a big battle, even by Revolutionary War standards, and we think of some other larger scale battles like Yorktown. But what was the significance of removing the British forces from Virginia for the overall war and for the war, how the war played out? It's hard to know in a negative what something affected, but how did this affect the strategy and the conduct of the war going forward?
So let me see if I can get the share off of there. Okay. So the fact that the Patriot forces in Virginia were able to significantly attrit the few regulars that were here had an immediate, tactical and operational impact on anything that the British would try to do. The British at this point were now facing rebellion in 13 of the colonies, and they had finite resources at that time. They were mobilizing forces in Europe and sending them to North America. In fact, about a week after the Battle of Great Bridge, a supply ship showed up in Norfolk Harbor with some reinforcements and a lot of weapons that Dunmore had asked for. And had he received those a month before, this whole story might be quite different. So the British government was in fact reacting, but they were also reacting to the situation and had to send forces to all the colonies to try to quell the rebellion. It didn't work. And fortunately for the Patriots in Virginia, they were able to have this major victory. What happened after the city of Norfolk was destroyed, and that's a whole nother discussion. But Lord Dunmore was not to be deterred. He was going to try to liberate Virginia. He was going to try to keep it in the royal realm. He went over to Portsmouth, now Portsmouth, Virginia, in the area of what's Hospital Point, where the U.S. Navy's military hospital is today, established a base, started foraging for supplies, and then in the spring found out that no more reinforcements were coming. So at that point, he was inclined to move. He moved up into the Chesapeake Bay, eventually landing at Gwen's Island up by Matthews County at the mouth of the Pasquotank River, and went ashore there. But the Patriots brought some artillery in, drove him off, and that was in early July. So just about the time that the Declaration of Independence is signed. And then in August, he left the Chesapeake Bay for good. What this did was it opened up Virginia to be able to allow their forces to deploy, now that there were 15 regular regiments being organized, not fully manned, but being organized. They were able to send those forces to support the Continental Army in other theaters. Some went to South Carolina initially. Most went to the Northern Theater and worked for General Washington as part of the Continental Army. So these were reliable forces. Washington knew the Virginia forces would be reliable. And when you study the long-term impact of Virginia and Massachusetts, they fielded the most regular units throughout the Revolution. And so without the two colonies, now states of Massachusetts and Virginia. Not only did they provide the military and sustainment, but the leadership that led the American Revolution for those two colonies. Without Virginia, the revolution would have failed, and this allowed Virginia to send those supplies to the Continental Army. One of the things that the British finally realized was we need to reoccupy Virginia, and that's when Benedict Arnold was sent down, and of course reinforced by Generals Phillips and then eventually Cornwallis. So those are the beginning and the end of the revolution. John likes to call it the alpha and omega of the revolution. So
that's great. And we'll hear from John in a second. One more question for you. You showed us the Billy Flora historical marker. Tell us a little bit about his role in the battle and why that turned out to be so critical.
So Billy Flora, we believe, and there are really no personal records that name him by name, but we believe he was the sentry that fired 8 times at the bridge. And it made a lot of sense that it would have been a Princess Anne District Minute Battalion soldier, light infantryman, that would have been out on the listening post at the bridge. Makes a lot of sense. And we believe that's what Billy was at the time. His continental service would start in November 1776. He would serve for 3 full years in the Continental Army. But we think he started out as a Princess Anne District Minute Battalion soldier. Billy is a free black man from Portsmouth. And so there is documentation to show that, free blacks were in fact serving voluntarily because this was a voluntary unit. Minute battalions were not traditional militia. They were volunteers. Additionally, we found another soldier who was a Nazmond Indian, a Native American, who named James Bass, who served at Great Bridge. And so the diversity that's represented in these few people that we can actually identify, because the records are just so poor, it's pretty important to understanding, who the Patriots were and how they fought the revolution. And fortunately, Billy Flora fought for, we think, at least 4 years, and survived, be able to come home and become a successful businessman in Portsmouth. And what's kind of fascinating about this story is we just recently did the commemoration of the battle this past Saturday, and we had a large ceremony, had over 50 patriotic organizations that presented wreaths. And I was at the ceremony doing some coordination for the Sons of the American Revolution. And I saw a family in the back, and one of the ladies was filming the proceedings. And I walked over and started talking to them. And it turns out they were descended from Billy Flora. So Billy's Flora family, they live in Maryland. And there were 4 or 5 family members there. So I had a nice conversation with them. So it's the human side of this story that we keep uncovering when we study these things and we celebrate our past.
And it's a really good reminder that many people took part in the revolution that we don't think of, whether it was Billy Flora or the Nazmond Indian from Virginia that you mentioned, whether if it was the woman on the home front so that men could go join and serve. Everybody had a part in the revolution when you kind of cast that wider lens to look at the revolution. We are going to now travel back in time a little bit to the 18th century and meet Mr. Stull, who is going to tell us about the Great Bridge Foundation and the work they do, and what people can see when they go there to visit. We have had many requests from people in the Chesapeake region over the years to do this battle in Encyclopedia Virginia. We were excited as part of our Revolutionary War section that we're working on now to be able to make this one of our very first entries. So we're excited to hear from John about the foundation and what you can see when you go down to Great Bridge.
Well, very good. Thank you, Madam Miller and Colonel Hannum. A marvelous rendition of the battle, even if I do say so myself. I was a courier for the good Colonel Woodford, and I just happened to remain behind in Great Bridge, and I'm sitting in the 3-Ton Tavern virtually. I understand in the museum. Now I'm really puzzled. I don't know how you got my image into this box, nor do I understand how you're talking currently and on this box. But with if you'll accept my apologies and trying to manipulate things here, I will do my best to time travel back and forth between the 18th century, where I'm very comfortable, indeed very comfortable, and the 21st century, where that have these boxes and gadgets, which I'm not too sure how best to apply, but bear with me. I would love to tell you about the museum, and I understand if I hit a certain button, I will disappear and an image of the museum will appear. So let's see if that happens. Well, I'm seeing something. I'm not too sure if I find myself here, but let's see, where is the image? I take it you all can see the image, or no? Is there an image up? Hello?
We can see your desktop, John, but not the actual presentation image.
Huh. Okay.
Try pulling up your PowerPoint.
Okay, let's see.
You can see your, yeah, we need to see your, try your PowerPoint button. There we go.
Is that it?
Not bad for someone from the 18th century. Yep, that's it.
Wow, amazing. It's amazing. Well, I'll do my best to survive in the 21st century. My apologies. But I am impressed with your ability to time travel back and forth. It's astounding indeed. But as mentioned, I am a docent with the Great Bridge Battlefield and Waterways Foundation. I'm sitting here in the 3-Ton Tavern, as I mentioned. This museum was opened June 19th, 2020. Yes, in the middle of the pestilence you called COVID. We are currently in our 4th year of operation. We've received not just local and regional visitors, but because we're located on the intercoastal, as you can see there, we receive visitors from we have received visitors from over 40 different states and places as far away as West Cameroon, Brazil, and Australia. Let's see. Oh, look, it even advances. Isn't that fascinating? The foundation itself was a creation of the efforts of local citizens and city officials dedicated for over 20 years to coordinate with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and certainly our key partner, the city of Chesapeake, to create the museum that we see here now. Its mission is fairly straightforward, basically to preserve, to promote, preserve, and to protect, preserve, and promote these 21st century folks with their alliteration. It's almost mind-boggling, but to protect, preserve, and promote the history of the Battle of Great Bridge on December 9th, and the region's Revolutionary War and canal building history, so that the public can understand the importance and the significance of these events, as we have done with this discussion here today. Now, Pat has done such a marvelous job of rendering the tale that took place here. I won't spend much detail here, other than that question that comes up often. And why build a museum for a battle that lasted only 30 minutes? What possible difference could it make? But the Battle of Bridge, as was mentioned, was the first land battle in Virginia and the first Patriot victory, demonstrating that Virginia militia could defeat British regulars. This had not been done before nor thought of. And then that forced Lord Dunmore out of Norfolk, leading to Virginians having to decide for self-governance and ultimately independence. Many of those who were undecided on whether they favored the convention or the Whig side of the politics or the crown felt that perhaps they should side with the Whigs. And so eventually Virginia does side for independence. And at the fifth convention held in May and June, they send Richard Henry Lee to the Second Continental Congress to put before that Congress the very motion that we should be free and independent states. So it is a very key thing for us here. The other key thing that Pat had alluded to is that vast watershed of the Chesapeake Bay was now available for us to use to get provisions to Washington's forces operating in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And in the absence of any British presence in the summer, we were free to have Virginia troops also go up to aid the good General Washington further north. As Pat mentioned, he stole my line, but when people think of Virginian Revolutionary War battles, they naturally think of Yorktown. And Yorktown certainly is the omega, but if Yorktown is the omega, Great Bridge is the alpha. The museum itself resides in Battlefield Historic Park. And this is basically at the intersection of Battlefield Boulevard, or the local State Route 168, and the Intercoastal Waterway. The Daughters of the American Revolution created a new monument that they placed there in 2006. And with the efforts of those of us at the museum and the city, we created a self-interpreting historic trail that leads for about a quarter of a mile, where you actually tread on the ground that British regulars tread and where they were engaged by Virginians. Its signage gives a synoptic view of several of the key aspects of the battle, and highlighting a certain number of figures that stand out in this battle. One that has been mentioned, Billy Flora, and one that comes to a surprise as many, another young man just a year older than Billy Flora, by the name of John Marshall, who I believe in other aspects of the country's history you know quite well as the longest serving Chief Supreme Court Justice, excuse me. Then, of course, the museum is where I am now, gives you a more detailed look at that discussion of the battle and the ongoing effort over the several hundreds of years of trying to connect the waterways of Carolina Sounds and the Chesapeake Bay. There are 8 galleries in the museum. I am sitting in one of them now at the 3-Ton Tavern. And in our attempt to try to get you to feel for what colonial Great Bridge was like and tavern life, we have a timeline on what the convention decides and what the crown decides that brings you into what we have as a battle theater and places you in the middle of that action on that cold Saturday morning in December 1775. Additionally, the museum highlights the ongoing drive to connect 2 vast watersheds, like I mentioned, the Chesapeake Bay and the Carolina Sounds. And that effort started with the construction of the Great Road in the 17th century that ran from Great Bridge down to Carolina. And that's why Great Bridge becomes a center of commerce. That connection by water was finally accomplished in the building of the Dismal Swamp Canal in 1805, followed by the Albemarle and Chesapeake Canal, which is the body of water that runs in front of the museum. The museum includes a gift shop. Naturally, we have to get our revenue someplace. And that may be especially attractive to some of you who might be out there this time of year. For those giving gifts to history lovers, shop has many unique crafts and books and art that reflects the Revolutionary period. In addition, we have a main room, or what we call the Great Hall, and it can be used for many different types of events. And for those who are seeking a different kind of venue for meetings, we could probably make sure that after your meeting or before, we can give you a tour of the museum that's there. But it's been used often for many different things: reunions, celebrations of life, renewing vows, wedding receptions. So food for thought next time you have to hold a meeting. We hold several different types of events throughout the year. Excuse me. And these are a few. We have anything from 3-ton tavern night for those that are thirsty for colonial ale and a hearty tune, to Christmas past and present that comes this Saturday, where we have crafts on how Christmas was celebrated throughout the ages. And we even allow a gentleman with a red coat in that day for the kids. Excuse me. And beyond the events above, the museum's schedule is often punctuated with school and group visits. Civic organizations, military units, along with public, private, and homeschool visits fill out our calendar. So the next time you come down Battlefield Boulevard, or for that matter, down the canal, remember to look to the east of the road and to the north side of the canal, and you'll see the museum. Please stop by to enjoy the park and the museum. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them, or to use the contact information below with these particular symbols that mean nothing to me, but hopefully something to you. Patti, that's pretty much what I had to say.
Thank you, Jon. That was great. And speaking of questions, we have some for our panelists today. So our first question is, were the British overconfident and assumed their military superiority would prevail at Great Bridge? I think that's a question for you, Pat.
Well, that is a difficult question to answer. The situation that occurred immediately before Great Bridge was an engagement with units, several companies, maybe up to 170 to 200. Numbers always get exaggerated. The British said 300. But they were troops that were forming, probably the Minute Battalion of the Princess Anne District. Now, the Princess Anne District included Isle of Wight County, Nassau County, the borough of Norfolk, or the city of Norfolk, Norfolk County, and Princess Anne counties. It's just named for Princess Anne, which was one of the lead counties in the district. But so I'm going to say probably under 200. I've read some things recently where maybe only half of those folks were actually armed, because public weapons were not readily available, and not everyone, had their own weapon. On the frontier, on the backcountry, yes, but not necessarily along the coast. So, as folks trickled into Kemp's Landing, the British knew it was an assembly area. Dunmore ordered the attack. A failed ambush by the Patriots took place, and they ran the Patriots off, basically. Between killed, wounded, and captured, probably 15 to 20. And that just proved to Dunmore that these people are not going to stand and fight. They're not trained. And the British had one of their grenadiers wounded in the knee. And that was the only casualty. So this was an indication that, we can overpower these people. We can intimidate them. They're not going to stand and fight. However, at Great Bridge, the circumstances were quite different. The units that were there were 11 companies of 6 of the 2nd Virginia Regiment. These were all volunteers, and they knew they were enlisting for a year. And the Culpeper Minute Battalion reorganized and were able to man 5 full companies. So there was 11 companies that constituted a regiment or a battalion task force, basically a full-strength regiment, over 700 men. They were well led. The officers there, all almost to the man, went on to serve additional in additional units. 2 of the company commanders, one of them that I mentioned already, Richard Kidder Meade, would serve as an aide to Washington himself, and was instrumental in the hanging of John Andre. He had to coordinate that in 1780 with the defection of Benedict Arnold. So these were officers who stood by the revolution. So they were the troops were well led, they were well motivated, and they were behind earthworks. And the British were on a narrow front. They could not maneuver. So there was this mass of 120 men packed together on an area that they couldn't maneuver, and they were in a perfect kill zone. So were the British overconfident? What options did Dunmore have? He thought cannon were on their way up from North Carolina, and he knew those would be able to batter down the walls of that wooden fort that he had built. He knew he had to hold that fort. Was it ill-conceived? Probably. Was it a desperation? Maybe. But the British thought they could dominate the Patriots, and they found out they couldn't. Unfortunately, a lot of men died because of that. So overconfidence, I don't know. It was a course of action that Dunmore ordered, and maybe it was with a little bit of hope he did it, but I don't know.
And to follow up on that, someone wants to know what happened to the Culpeper Minutemen between this engagement and later when the war moves to the south again.
So what happens? The minute battalions are not particularly successful. Culpeper is the one exception in Virginia. There were 16 minute districts created by the act of the Third Convention. They lasted about a year. And then they went to the more traditional militia that was called up by class. And of course, in the interim, Virginia created 15 regiments. So I think almost every one of the company commanders that was at Great Bridge went on to serve in continental units. So a lot of those men then joined with their commanders. So, and we think that's what Billy Flora did in the Princess Anne District Minute Battalion. He stayed with his company commander, who would have been his company commander in the 15th Virginia Regiment. So, so Culpeper was an exception to the trend in Virginia, and they did, show up in mass and did fight. Now they even had to reorganize at Williamsburg because they didn't have enough weapons either. So, in one pension application I found, one of the Culpeper Minutemen said, "I sent my son home to go back to school, and the father stayed to fight." So people had to make those decisions just like we do today about what they're going to do. But the son then went on later in the war to fight and survive. And he's the pension request we have was his that showed that he fought later in the war as well. But he was at Great Bridge with his, or was at Williamsburg with his dad, but his dad sent him home. So yeah, so that's Culpeper is a great story. The Culpeper Sons of the American Revolution are very active. Their chapter is very active, and they're going to hold a muster at the end of October in 1775, and they're inviting the family members of anybody that they can document that served in that unit at any point to come and participate in that ceremony. So yeah, Culpeper special in my book.
Well, and I'll give a plug, as I mentioned, this is really the beginning of Encyclopedia Virginia section on the American Revolution. It's a 3-year project. It will take us through all the major anniversaries through 1776. And we do have an entry planned on the Culpeper Minutemen. So there's a lot of these elements that we're talking about today, we will be fleshing out and hopefully doing more presentations on, because all of these aspects are obviously really interesting. Another question, you mentioned Billy Flora was a Minuteman, about Billy Flora fighting on the Patriot side. As many people are probably aware, Lord Dunmore offered freedom to enslaved people who would fight for the British, who were in opposition to Patriots who were in opposition to the British. And my understanding, I think, from our entry is that they were called the Ethiopian Regiment. They were supposed to have a role in Great Bridge. They were supposed to be a diversionary force, and for whatever reason that didn't happen. They played a larger role at the Battle of Kemp's Landing, where they did successfully push back the Patriot ambush. The question this viewer has is, it's a little, it's such a interesting question about freedom. It's what makes this battle interesting from the point of view is which side of the battle best represented the ideal of freedom for people. I mean, the British had explicitly promised freedom. Billy Flora was promised nothing. We don't know why he fought. I don't think we have enough insight to know why that was. Oftentimes it was his home. It was his probably people he knew. That's, personal reasons, but it is a interesting commentary on what freedom meant on this war. And what do you think about that, Pat?
Well, I guess, explained to me years ago, what you see depends on where you sit, and so the same thing in life. If I were enslaved, I don't think I'd be very happy, and if I saw there was an opportunity to get out, even if I was going to risk my life, I might do it. Some enslaved people chose not to do that. Others did. So it was a very individual choice. And what they decided to do, and we all know the institution of slavery was not good. Jefferson said it best in 1820. I think during the Compromise of 1820, the quote that slavery was like holding a wolf by the ears. You don't dare let it go, because it meant upsetting economic and social order throughout the South. Now, one of the things that's interesting about Virginia is it is the most populous state or colony at the time of the American Revolution. From what we can tell, about 600,000 people live in Virginia. Probably a third, and I've seen numbers that show higher than that, are Black, are African Americans, and most of those are enslaved. So there is a real fear in the South, really from Maryland south, that if you abolish slavery, what happens to the slaves, right? And so the fear of a slave rebellion. So much of the South during the American Revolution is the same kind of mindset as you have in the Caribbean, and that is the slaves outnumber the free white people. But don't forget, in Virginia, that there's also indentures. So when Dunmore issues his proclamation after Kemp's Landing, he's not only going after enslaved people who want to liberate themselves, but he's also looking at the indentured servants, and he offers them the same deal. But his wording of his proclamation is very clear: of the patriots. So he wasn't liberating indentured servants or enslaved people of the loyalists. He was targeting that. And this is what you find throughout the war, is that this dilemma. So there's never a policy decision by either the British government or the Patriot government about slavery. It vacillates back and forth. And so slaves are welcome on the Patriot side if they're approved by their owners to enslavers to actually serve. And we have cases of that. And we have one of those at Great Bridge. And so what we found. So he was serving voluntarily because his boss said, "Hey, you can go. I'm going to serve, but I'm going to send you in my place." And he did. His name was Ned Streeter. He was from Nazareth County, what's now modern Suffolk. So the answer is it's very different for each human being based on how they saw things.
And remember also at the time, if I could jump in, they're making decisions for themselves, not knowing that this is going to be a war of 6 years. They're thinking it's going to be just the campaign season until winter quarters, and then everything will be decided because of the conflicts will be decisive the Patriot side, if I use that term, comes to its senses. But as we know, in reflection on history, that's not what happens.
And while we have you, tell us about the significance of the Three Tub Tavern. Someone wants to know, John.
Oh, well, certainly. I first ran across it here as far as the 3 Ton Tavern. Being an old Marine like Pat, that organization allegedly was found in Ton Tavern in Philadelphia. So hearing the 3 Ton Tavern kind of sparked my interest. 3 Ton was for sale on South Island, which was the land area north of the village of Great Bridge and south of the southern branch of the Elizabeth River, where the wharfs were. And that's all we really know about it, other than what we see in other accounts concerning how taverns were structured and why they were there. Of course, every town had a tavern, and it wasn't because everybody wanted to overindulge in a tavern, but if you're on the road, towns were every 12 to 15 miles because that was a day's travel. And so you needed to stay someplace. A tavern or an ordinary would be a place where you could stay while you're transiting. And certainly you needed something to drink. You might tire of tea after a while, which was also a very popular drink. And then, of course, a little after 1775, prohibited. And even in 1775, tough to get. But the tavern was important because you fermented water to make ale. And so the water that was local was generally not clean enough to drink unless it was spring water. And there's few of that around, at least in the swamp. And so you could boil it for tea or ferment it for ale, and that could give you a healthy drink. So to your health. 3 tons reflects the volume. A ton, I believe, is 216 imperial gallons, which is basically 6 what we consider aging barrels now for U.S. for whiskey. 6 of those would make a ton.
We have time for one quick question, and I will preface this by saying a little bit of a teaser. This is a question about the city of Norfolk. Our next entry coming up, which Pat has also generously contributed for us, is about the burning of Norfolk and the strategic importance of Norfolk. So stay tuned. We'll be talking about that. But someone was curious whether recapturing Norfolk was considered prior to the attack. Was that part of the overall plan of the Great Bridge attack?
So yes. The instructions that Woodford received were basically to cross the James River, and he received these on the 24th of October from the Committee of Safety. Cross the James River with a substantial force, occupy Norfolk and Princess Anne counties, and defeat the British forces under Dunmore. So we would consider that a military task, and then they had to figure out how to actually do that. So so Norfolk was part of that formula. Eventually, what you'll find out is no one has enough force to hold it, and that's the dilemma that both the British and the Patriots come to. And in the end, it's not there anymore.
They solved that problem. Well, I will say stay tuned, because that's one of our next Revolutionary War entries that are coming up. It's really fascinating. Perhaps the story isn't exactly what you think it is or what you were told. It's another story. If Great Bridge is an undertold story, Norfolk is kind of a mistold story. So that's another, we will definitely be diving into that. But it's time for us to wrap things up for today. Thank you very much, Pat and John, for sharing your expertise with us and everyone who tuned in. If you found today's event valuable, please consider becoming a supporter of EV. Your donations help keep our entries and events like this free and online for everyone. And I will drop a link into the chat where you can do that. And also, please consider subscribing to the Encyclopedia Virginia newsletter to find out about our new entries when they do come out, such as our entry on Norfolk, and new entries, events like this. I'm also going to drop a link into the chat for that as well. So thank you, everyone. And I'll say farewell to Pat and farewell to John from the 18th century. Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Hey, Pat, well done.
What do you think, John? You a happy camper?
Oh, yeah. I mean, as long as they're happy campers, I'm a happy camper. How can I go wrong? I'm in the tavern, right?
So I guess I'll see you tomorrow morning.
Yes, sir. We will. I'm going to get an email out right after I leave this and give the basic concept in that. But yeah, we'll see him.
Okay. Yeah. I got